or illustrate this rather, excuse me, as a way to continue adding more clarity, right? So this is one of the most important aspects of learning something, is just repeating it over and over and over again in different ways. And that repetition is really going to help you be able to recall it during your exam and on your tests and so on, okay? So let's look at the action potential. Let's actually draw out that curve here and just describe this in a more holistic way one more time. All right, so this is our two axes here. We've got the membrane potential here. On the Y, and this is in millivolts. And then we've got time here on the X in milliseconds, okay? Now, the first thing we want to put are our important values. So we know that -70 is our rest, all right? We know that -55 is our threshold. Okay, I'm also going to put in here for reference our -85, which is our hyperpolarization, our overshooting as a part of the restoring of the membrane potential. And then all the way up here, we'll put our peak of the action potential, which is +30. Okay, so let's kind of make this distinction here. Okay, so the first thing we want to establish is that we're starting at rest. So we start at rest. Let's actually use a different color here. So we start at rest, and then via our graded potentials, we get up to our threshold, okay? And then we see the depolarization, which is the rapid upstroke here. And then we see the repolarization, our rapid downstroke, going all the way down to -55, okay? Which includes, this part is going to be that hyperpolarization. And then we see the restoration of the membrane potential. So let's put that in purple. Okay, back to rest. So let's describe each of these phases here. So the first thing is we've got graded potentials. So the first part of our curve represents our graded potentials. And we'll talk about what these are, but these can be IPSPs or EPSPs. These are different types of graded potential that we'll get into later on, but essentially IPSPs are negative or hyperpolarizing events. EPSPs are positive or depolarizing events. So we can have different types of graded potentials that could potentially get the membrane potential closer to threshold. So it gets the membrane potential closer to threshold, which we know to be -55 millivolts. Okay, so that's what that green part of the curve represents. Let's look at the upstroke here. So the upstroke is represented by the depolarization. In other words, sodium moving into the cell. Right, sodium moving inward, or washing into the cell according to its ECDF. And let's think about the permeability here, right? So make sure that you're connecting what the permeability is to these types of movements. So if I increase my permeability for sodium, which is created by the activation gates opening, inactivation gate also open, that results in depolarization, okay? But let's also think about the state of our other channel here as well. So we have a decreased permeability to potassium relative to sodium, right? Relative to sodium at this time. And then that is created because our voltage gated potassium channels are closed, okay? And so what we see here is the membrane potential becomes more positive. Okay, let's look at repolarization. So the downward slope of our curve here. So repolarization is caused because of potassium's movement outward. Okay. And again, looking at the details of why that happens, if we look at our two ions and their permeabilities, we now see a decreased permeability to sodium. That is because inactivation gates are closed, but activation gates are open. Remember, when we get back to rest, that third phase, which is triggered from positive 30, we now see activation gates open, but then the inactivation gates are closed. So activation gate open, inactivation gate close. Okay. And then as far as potassium, we now see an increase in potassium's permeability, which is due to the opening of its voltage gated channels becoming open. And so the overall membrane potential change is more negative. Okay, everyone with me so far? Can we see how these events are being created by the permeabilities, which are being created by the states of the ion channels, right? Okay, and then the last part here, which is this purple part of the curve, is really the hyperpolarization. So how we go from hyperpolarized back up to rest, okay? So let's look at that state here. So here we have an increased permeability to potassium still lingering around. Potassium channels are still open. And so this is why we go lower than -70 as potassium tries to approach its equilibrium potential. And that is because the voltage gated potassium channels are still open, right? They're closing, but they're still open, right? So I'm going to put closing here, in that they're trying to close, but they're not all fully closed, okay? And so the membrane potential overshoots rest and then returns to -70. Oops. Then returns to -70, okay? Now in brackets here, I'm also going to put the sodium potassium pump. They're also playing a huge role in correcting this hyperpolarization. So in brackets here, I'll put the sodium potassium pump, which is also contributing to this restoration of that -70. Okay. All right. Any questions on this? Sort of kind of tying everything together. Any questions here? All righty. So here's a really nice study tool. This summary table kind of, encapsulates everything that we just drew out, as well as everything that we've spoken about. So again, different perspectives of looking at each of these events, right? What is the membrane potential looking like? What channels are open? What ions are flowing, right? And just looking at different aspects of these events, what's happening at rest, what's happening during depolarization, what's happening during repolarization, and then what's happening from hyperpolarization to get us back to that rest. Okay, so make sure that you use this table, try to clear out everything in here and try to create this table from your understanding. So don't just memorize these values or memorize, the words here, but actually understand what's happening and try to recreate this table as a study tool. Okay, another excellent study tool here. So again, thinking about the properties with which graded potentials differ from action potentials, right? In terms of their strength, right? Action potentials are really strong, graded potentials are pretty weak, right? Pretty not meaningful, right? Not sustained. In terms of the ability to sum, action potentials cannot sum. We'll talk about this going forward. It's either one or nothing. They cannot be added, they cannot sum in their magnitude or amplitude, whereas graded potential, did have the ability to exhibit spatial and temporal summation. Also think about the ions that are moving. We'll talk a little bit about this going forward in terms of IPSPs and EPSPs. So there are different ions involved in graded potential movement, or different ions moving involved in graded potentials. But as far as the action potential, there are only two ions that are involved, sodium and potassium. Okay, so again, think about clearing out this table and being able to recreate this table from your understanding of